The Third Rail, confronting our pension failures.
This book is a book about the looming pension crisis that we've been talking for 30 years about in Canada, and we all think we know about it, but no one really wants to look at it and understand it. And this book is designed for everyone that wants to understand more, because guess what? It's coming. 40% of our workplace is going to retire in the next 20 years, the largest outmigration in Canadian history. And so this is going to be a burden for our economies, for our societies, and for individuals. And we hope more than anything that this book is a book that is accessible and understandable, and you'll go away and say, okay, I get it, and okay, it's possible to change and reform. There are several stages of reform. The first stage is crisis, and we went through that in 2008. And that crisis exposed the weakness in a number of pension plans, mostly in cities and in states. And so those people, those funds went over the cliff. They had to be dealt with. And the reform can be very painful, or it can be far-sighted based on the degree of the emergency. So I think Canadians saw firsthand the personal impact of a pension crisis when Northern Telecom, Nortel, declared bankruptcy. And suddenly we were looking at the prospect of people in their 70s and 80s who'd worked their whole career at one of our most successful companies in its time, facing the prospect of having to going back to work, giving up a series of benefits. And I think that crystallized for a lot of Canadians that they were vulnerable. We borrowed this from Rhode Island, which is one of the case studies that we look at. The third rail is that third line in the subway that nobody wants to touch. You touch it politically, whether you're in a corporation or in a union, you're dead, because it is inevitably going to involve painful compromises and decisions that people are afraid of. They were the ones that have most recently undergone reforms, and we felt that the three that we chose offered sort of the full rainbow of pension reform. The worst case scenario was Rhode Island, one of a very troubled state that had not addressed problems that had been building up for decades, so they went over the cliff. New Brunswick was one that was facing going over the cliff, and so they were able to preserve and institute a new system before they went over the cliff. And the best system in the world is the Netherlands. And they are very far-sighted. They saw the crisis coming and introduced reforms before they hit the crisis. So we wanted you to get the full range of sort of before, during, and after, and the message being the earlier you act, the less painful it has to be. I think it depends where you are. If you're the federal government, they just don't want to go there. After the financial crisis, it looked like we were going to see some reform. The great thing about retirees is that they're very organized, they're very educated, and very outspoken. And we saw that in Northern Telecom. There was a lot of pressure there. There was the financial crisis. We were looking at 25% underfunding in the pension fund. So it was a crisis. And as we started to pull out of it, Ottawa backed away from it. And it was really, I think, a disappointment to a lot of people. That was the moment. You look in various jurisdictions. We're looking at Ontario that's coming up with ideas. New Brunswick reformed because it had to. Prince Edward Island, Alberta, everyone is starting to look at what they can do. So we're seeing the provinces take the lead here in Canada, not the federal government. I think the main issue is that we all have to acknowledge that the current system no longer works. And it's really simple to explain. We're living much longer than anyone anticipated. People are living longer in their retirement than they did in their careers. And the math is simple. The other issues are low return environment. We are in a low interest rate environment. For the longest time, pension funds were able to secure a good investment future for their retirees because they could invest in stable instrument like bonds. That stopped when interest rates went down. We saw them move increasingly into securities, stocks, and other sort of stock market related activities. And then we had the dot-com bubble bursting, and we had the financial crisis, which showed how vulnerable and volatile the returns could be. And I think the other real issue, which a lot of Canadians don't acknowledge, is that they have not saved enough. This is a long-term issue that they're going to deal with. To save enough for your retirement, you have to imagine yourself as an old person, and that's not something that young people are inclined to do. One of the things that we hope that comes out of this book is that younger people will pay more attention and will be more engaged in this, because they are going to be bearing the burden of this problem if it isn't fixed, because either they're not going to have the pension plans, or they're going to be paying for the benefits for retirees for plans that they'll never be eligible for. They need to pay attention to this. There's never been such a large exodus from the workplace ever in history, in Canadian history anyway. It is a huge number. It is the baby boom generation retiring, and it is going to be a burden on the system. Some people think the solution is to take away the gold-plated pensions. We focus and we zero in on the public sector and say they have pensions that I don't. Therefore, the solution is to take it away. And this is how Jim got me engaged in the book. That is not the answer. That's going to cost us all more in the long run, as taxpayers will be paying more in terms of guaranteed income supplements and old age security. That's no solution. That's pushing the problem down the road, which is how we got in this problem to begin with. I think the key is that the Canada Pension Plan does need to be expanded, and it needs to be expanded for the segment that's most vulnerable. That's those people earning over $30,000 or under $100,000. These are people who, under the CPP, are the most vulnerable. The majority, and this is for people that don't have existing pension plans. It is a mandatory form of savings. I think it's the only way we can assure that Canadians can have the kind of retirement that they can sustain themselves with without causing in the long term a bigger burden for the taxpayer. You look at the incomes today, you look at the fact that 60% of Canadians don't have a pension plan. It's a math equation. They're going to experience a substantial drop in their income, and that doesn't just affect them, it affects all of us as an economy. Their buying power, their consumer impact on the economy, it's going to affect everything. It's going to affect all of us. I think what interests me is the people. I think the thing that both Jim and I learned doing this book is that it takes leadership to address these issues. And the people that we met in New Brunswick, in the Netherlands, in Rhode Island, were mavericks, outliers, who touched the third rail. They didn't die. They lived, and they did something quite heroic. It is uplifting what these people accomplished, and it's quite extraordinary. And I'll tell you a story about one woman that I'm particularly fond of, Marilyn Quinn, the head of the Nurses Union in New Brunswick, who is facing a substantial drop in their pension benefits to the tune of more than 50%. She'd been a nurse her whole life. She'd been a palliative care nurse, and she said, well, I put on my palliative care glasses. And I said, what do you mean by palliative care glasses? And she said, I put on my palliative care glasses because when you're in palliative care, that's where you have the tough discussions. That's where you face the tough issues. We needed to face it. And I thought it was a wonderful way of explaining what we all need to do to deal with the looming pension crisis, because it is coming and we do need to talk about it.
The Third Rail: Confronting Our Pension Failures. Written by Jim Leach and Jacquie McNish. Published by Signal.